Welcome to Human Rights Education Now, a podcast series from Human Rights Educators USA. I'm your host, Bill Fernikes, a member of the National Steering Committee of HRE USA, a collaborative network to learn, teach, organize, advocate, and innovate for human rights education in the United States. This podcast aims to raise awareness about human rights education and invites listeners to engage with the worldwide movement to make human rights education a core focus of educational programs from preschool through higher education and in both non-formal and informal community educational settings. Today's program is a conversation with Dr. Teresa Cappiali, currently a resident fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies at Mohammed VI Polytechnic University in Morocco. Holding a Ph.D. in political science from the Université de Montréal, she has conducted extensive research and consultancy work across North Africa, Europe, and North America, and recently authored the book Transformative Emancipatory Pedagogy, that's TEP, to Reimagine Education, published in September 2025 by Palgrave Macmillan. In this episode, Teresa discusses the origins of her interest in human rights and human rights education, how her undergraduate and graduate studies influenced her work on Transformative Emancipatory Pedagogy, TEP, the role of humanism as a basis for her pedagogical framework, how TEP improves learner outcomes, suggestions on how TEP can be used by human rights educators in their daily work, the ways in which TEP can be deployed to strengthen human rights protections for migrants, the importance of centering controversy as a key focus on classroom instruction, individuals who have inspired her human rights work, key quotes that reflect her approach to human rights education, and finally, her key recommendations for advancing human rights education globally. Institute for Advanced Studies at Mohammed VI Polytechnic in Morocco. She also is a senior researcher at Raoul Wallenberg Institute in Sweden, and the founder and CEO of No Innovation Without Education. How are you today, Teresa?
Hi, Bill. I'm great. What about you?
I'm fine. I'm struggling with a little bit of a cold, but we'll do okay. So tell me how you first became interested in human rights issues and subsequently in the idea of education for transformation.
Let me start by saying that I am a scholar in migration studies, and I came to work on education only later in my scholarship. But before we speak about my trajectory as an academic, I would like to start by saying that human rights education, and especially education for transformation, they are part of my own life story. So today I'd like to share a bit about my journey and how and why I think the education is so important for me today. So since I was very little, I carried a strong sense of justice, and for personal reasons connected to my family history, I also developed the ability to attune myself to others people's suffering. So feeling that suffering, holding it, and later understanding that it could be transforming to empathy and action, a shape to who I am. I came to see it not as a burden, but as my greatest gift. So, and also as an adult, I was deeply inspired by this famous Italian singer called Fabrizio De André, whose music and poetry gave dignity to people living in marginalized condition in Italian society. And finally, my parents as well instilled in me the importance of integrity and of seeing humanity in every person. So all this kind of aspect that concern my life as a child and then as a young adult, they influence me greatly and give me both an ethical compass and the emotional grounding to pursue human rights as a life mission. So now as an adult and as an educator, I want to be a role model. I feel like a duty to transmit this passion for human rights to my students. And especially in the times we live, my mission is to help empower younger generation to shape the world they deserve to live in. So education became the natural path for me, a way to transform suffering into healing in my own life. And this is also something I want to share with my students. You will see during our conversation the importance of healing and healing trauma in my idea of education today. Have I answered to your question, Bill?
Oh, sure. But let's take it a little further. How did your undergraduate and graduate study sort of influence your ideas about pedagogy? And then talk about the core concepts that serve as the foundation for your work in what you have labeled transformative emancipatory pedagogy.
Yeah, thank you. Great question. So let me start by saying that I did most of my studies in Italy. And basically all levels of education when I was growing up and still today in Italy are marked by very traditional teacher-centered approaches to education. What I call in my work the first educational paradigm. I spent most of my time reading, listening, memorizing, and also reproducing knowledge. And there was little space throughout my education for dialogue or for connecting what we learn to live experience. At the same time, life outside was happening, and the classroom was not teaching me the skill I needed to actually survive and thrive in society, right? So the contrast showed me very clearly that what we should not be doing as educators, especially in a world going through rapid social change like the one we're living in, we cannot afford to have an education that asks students still to memorize and to learn in a passive way. So let's say this was already clear for me as a young undergraduate student, but became clear later on. So one step ahead was when I moved to Canada for my Ph.D. studies. And this is where I encounter what I call the second paradigm, which is rooted in progressive education and strongly influenced by John Dewey's work. And most of your listeners who come from the US are very familiar with this approach. But for me, it was quite new, especially in higher education. Still today in Italy, we teach with a very old school method, so to speak. So here in this, what we call horizontal or teacher-centered approach, students are encouraged to learn through experience and active participation. And for me, at the time, it was a glimpse of what was possible, a more horizontal and engaging way of learning. But I must say now that even then, I felt something was missing. And that's how then I moved forward in my journey. So the realization became sharper when I started my doctoral research on migrants from the Maghreb in Italy, and later when I taught students from diverse backgrounds. I felt that the methods we were using in higher education to teach sensitive and controversial topics, especially in my field, migration, like in a polarized society, there are so many sensitive topics that I teach every day. So I felt that the Duan approach, the more horizontal approach, was not enough. First of all, most of the time we engage students more rationally, like cognitively. We are not engaging with their lived experience. So there is so much that they bring into the classroom that we are not able to use for pedagogical purposes. And so this is how I started experimenting with my students, teaching topics that I was researching on, like racism, discrimination, and see how I could twist certain ways of teaching in higher education to make the teaching more relevant for them. And so this is what later inspired also one of my most transformative workshops on racism that I describe also in my recent book, where students learn to see what they could not otherwise see without stepping into someone else's shoes. And this is probably where you also see the link with human rights education and my work. So seeing how powerful these activities were, I began searching for theoretical frameworks. In mainstream higher education, I found very little systematic research on this type of pedagogy. And so I looked beyond. And this is where I met scholars and also through my readings and also through my engagement with academics, on human rights education, but also non-formal education and grassroots practices, and particularly in two geographical areas where these approaches are very much used, which is Latin America and North America. This is where I discover critical pedagogy, both by looking at the work by Paulo Freire and the pedagogy of the oppressed, but also bell hooks, who actually wrote for the first time for me, that's where I met the word transformative and transformative pedagogy when she started speaking about Paulo Freire in her work. But again, today we cannot, overlook the importance also of indigenous and decolonial approaches and how they are shaping the debate of education today. So these kind of encounters open up new possibilities and gave me the missing puzzle piece for my academic teaching at the time, which is education can be also emancipatory, deeply connected to lived experience of student and social justice, even in higher education, where we tend to be more traditional in the way we teach. So over time, I realized I was not alone. Many colleagues around the world are actually experimenting with similar practices, often in small spaces or niches, driven by vocation. So my attempt in my work is to give more visibility to this work, to systematize it in a way that then I can speak back to the approaches that have informed my work. And human rights education has been essential in that sense, because I hope it will emerge in our conversation, TAP and human rights, TAP, this approach that I call TAP, Transformative Emancipatory Pedagogy, and human rights education have many overlaps. There is cross-fertilization happening, and if you say convergence in that sense. But it's very important to say to our audience that the TAP is not inventing anything new. It's a new way of looking at practices that are already happening, especially in fields like human rights education and peace education.
So in your recently published book, Transformative Emancipatory Pedagogy, TEP or TEP, to reimagine education, you use the concept of humanism as a basis of your philosophical framework. So what are the key concepts from humanism that you employ, and how does it connect to human rights education?
Yeah, I'm happy you're asking this question again, so I can also complete my answer earlier on. So just to be clear, I do emphasize these two terms and put them together. So education should be both transformative and emancipatory. So at the heart of my work, then, there are these two core concepts, transformation and emancipation. In my book, I connect transformation to humanism and emancipation to humanization and decolonial philosophies. I draw on humanism because it emphasizes the inherent dignity, worth, and potential of every person. Values that also lie at the very heart or core of human rights education. So for us, humanism is not only about dignity, but also about empathy, solidarity, and responsibility towards one another. Human rights education in this sense is not just about knowing your rights, correct me if I'm wrong, but about living them, defending them, and extending them to others. So it's living human rights. And this is the huge debate in human rights education about learning about, through, and for human rights. But so I'm deeply inspired myself by an Italian educator that many know, who is called Maria Montessori, who lived many years ago, more than a century ago. She placed the dignity and potential of the child at the center of her philosophy. That's why also in my book, I define her as one of the founders of a humanist view of education. And she's not the only one, of course. John Dewey is also a humanist philosopher in that sense. So this humanistic vision shows that education must cultivate independence, empathy, responsibility, and peace. So there is nothing new about this, but also demonstrated that pedagogy can be scientific. So based on careful observation while remaining deeply humanistic. So it's not only about ideals or about ideology. She showed that a method that was attentive to the child will bring the best out of the child, both as a human being and also as a learner. So being a better person for her was part of the goal of education. But there is even something more important that I want to emphasize, is that while humanism recognizes the dignity and potential of every human being, humanization asks us to remove the barriers that prevent people from realizing their humanity. So there is, for me, no humanism without humanization. And this is why I'm saying this is because we live in societies that are increasingly unequal. And also in higher education, all the students coming from all over the world, and not only them, they are affected by conflicts directly and indirectly. They are affected by so many changes happening in society. So we need to be aware that in the classroom, we cannot expect students to come and not facing resistance towards learning because of the many challenges the youth is facing today. So humanization is also respond to a very practical need to take care of these resistances that we find in the classroom, to allow students to learn more, better, much deeper, but also become human beings that are happy and that thrive in this society. So in my conclusion of the book, that's why I came to the idea that we need a humanizing pedagogy for all. Whilst often these approaches of humanization are used by marginalized community, and we can learn a lot from these approaches where we see how we can transform injustice systems, I believe that everyone needs this pedagogy to thrive in this world. So in here, I draw inspiration also from a famous Buddhist, Thich Nhat Hanh, who shared this idea of interbeing. So the recognition that our dignity is bound up with one another and with all forms of lives. And I try in this methodology that I call TAP to translate also this broad philosophical principle into pedagogical intervention that allow us to broaden the scope of education. Have I answered your question?
Yes, wonderfully. You've spoken in your book about what you call the key ingredients of TEP. And I'm just going to list them: meaningful content, a prepared environment, interconnected activities, and ethics. So how did these elements come together in practice, and why do they matter for human rights education?
So I will start by saying if we want to move away from traditional ways of teaching, as I said, where the teacher comes into the classroom and explains the subject, or again, in a more horizontal approach, where we debate with each other about key topics and students present material or projects. There is a twist. And again, I take this idea from Montessori, but adapted to TAP, and is the idea of a prepared environment. So where we create new spaces for learning, where many of the things I was sharing with you, so students' empowerment, deep learning, other goals like inclusion, they come together into this educational journey that I define more technically pedagogical interventions. So everything starts with a key element that I say that is prepare environment. So everything begins with it. Without the right condition, even the best content will fall flat. So a prepare environment is both physical and relational. So it means that we arrange a space to encourage dialogue, setting ground rules of respect, and creating a culture of trust where students feel safe to take risks. But it also means making the space intellectually challenging, where learners know they will be asked to confront difficult questions, but in a supportive way. So one example I offer in my book, but just an example for inspiration for others educators to develop that through their work, is to see how to teach the topic of racism. I start with several visual materials where they are exposed to different views and perspectives in society, from far-right groups, racism in football, in politics, but also anti-racism and the different perspective of anti-racism in society. So this allows to create the condition, for instance, to activate what Meziro in transformative learning theory speaks about as disorienting dilemma. So you create a context where you want to achieve certain things. So in the case of racism, I chose disorienting dilemma because at the time I was teaching in Sweden, and in Sweden there is a strong resistance to admit that there is racism in Swedish society. So I had to twist it, drawing from psychology and research on racism, so to kind of circumvent the possible resistance student may have in my classroom to recognize that racism exists in Sweden. And there are many strategies like that. This is just an example to say how an environment is prepared for change, learning, but also transformation to happen in this kind of activities. And so the second one is meaningful content. Once that environment is in place, content can truly become meaningful. So what kind of material we choose, how we connect it together, at what point in time, creates this incremental learning for students to get closer, both cognitively and emotionally, to a topic that is so complex like racism. But the twist is that content is not given from above. It is co-constructed, connected with students' experience, questions, and identities. So that's why I call it prepare environment as well, is because there is a part of it that is structured, but also once the student enters into this learning space, there are many choices they can make to also decide how to connect to the material. For example, in courses of migration, we might combine testimonies from migrants, theoretical readings, also, as I say earlier, different perspective from society, and also student own reflection on mobility and belonging. And this kind of teaching becomes even more interesting if you consider that many students in our classrooms today are from all kinds of backgrounds. Most of my students when I started developing TAP were coming from all over the world. So when I was teaching in Sweden, only 2 or 3 students were from Nordic countries. The rest was coming from the EU, but also non-European countries. So, but then, just to conclude, there are other 2 elements. One is called connective activities, where basically the pedagogy then unfolds through these interconnected activities. They are designed as a sequence. So, for instance, students start from self-reflection, then they move into small group exchanges, then in full classes dialogue, and finally, maybe they develop and apply projects based on what they've learned. So this gradual movement allows students to grow in confidence, depth, and empathy over time. Each step builds on previous one, so that by the end of the course or of a program, learners not only acquire knowledge, but also practice collaboration and critical analysis. And of course, last but not least, is to include ethical practice. So we speak a lot today about the teacher as being a role model. But because relational learning in this methodology is so important, students are constantly learning also from each other, then we need to create a space where students learn how to dialogue with each other with respect, how to learn from each other, how to also exercise compassion towards one another, especially when some topics are particularly challenging.
Well, what you're talking about in many ways is what in the United States, for example, has been called issues-based education. And it's very interesting how parallel what you're discussing is. But I'd like you to now walk us through how a teacher, an educator would design a journey using your TEP approach. Well, what would that look like?
Yeah, I think I tried already to introduce this point in my last answer. So I build on that to explain a bit more how this would look like in practice. So let me invite you to imagine something. So again, imagine a world without lectures. So no more student passively sitting while a teacher speaks for hours. Instead, imagine education as a journey with different stages along the way. So then we envision a way in which learners move through experiences such as dialogue circles, role plays, collaborative project, and reflective writing. But those aspects, that's why I call them interconnected activities, they are not compartmentalized. They work together so that we can combine them in a way that different aspects of learning are involved. So, and that's why I speak about a scientific pedagogy in the sense that we can become more reflective of the work many of us are already doing in the classroom to make sure that what we are doing is also supported by reeducation and theories of learning, how students learn and what they should learn and then how they learn. So all these activities are designed to engage students cognitively, emotionally, relationally, and also politically. I explain this more vastly in the book, but just to give you an example. Take, for example, an entire course where students are asked to save the world and make it a place where all communities and living beings can thrive. So you have a first phase where students need to collaborate to understand how they can save the world. And the second one is, and then how the world can be transformed to be a welcoming place for everyone. Of course, they cannot literally save the world in a semester, but these ambitions or this ambitious challenge sets the stage for an educational journey that really engages the students more holistically, allows them to work with each other towards solving one of the major challenges of our time, which is saving the world. Along the way, students develop social-emotional skills to collaborate, so we can emphasize also some exercises around this. And then identify urgent issues, also look for reliable data, see where this data is. It's not obvious. Also, especially in times where we have fake news and many statistics can be manipulated, it's a very important skill the students need to learn. And so also solving complex problems along the way, because there are different negotiations to be made, this also requires collective solutions and to draw on interdisciplinary knowledge. But I'm going to push this further. Just as importantly, students here are practicing empathy by putting themselves in the shoes of the voiceless. So this is an element of the philosophy of TEP, as I mentioned earlier, a humanizing philosophy that also bring the voices of the voiceless. But when I say bringing the voice in of the voiceless, I mean it literally. What if the wells, forests, and rivers had a voice in the decision-making to decide how the world should be run in the future? How would that change how we think about justice, rights, and responsibility? So this kind of games, which we see very widely used in human rights education, that's where I also got inspiration, can be included in new ways of interconnecting these activities more meaningful. So it's not about reinventing education entirely, but it's playing with the ingredients we have already and integrating into a more systematic way of doing this work. So it's not that I am replacing anything that is done or I or others colleagues who are working in the same direction, we are just capitalizing on so many things that have been done. And maybe one innovative element is to bring it to higher education, where even human rights educators, sometimes they have a different way of teaching when they are working in programs on human rights education. And then when they teach in universities, that's the approach is different, you know. So the idea is how we can bring this wonderful experience coming from different fields also into mainstream education.
So let's follow up on that, because I think you're hitting on a very important issue, and that is resistance by people who are comfortable with the current way of affairs, right? They say that, well, I'm very comfortable being teacher-centered. I'm very comfortable telling the students what to do. So how would you approach the idea of institutional change, which is really very important if you're going to have TEP become more prominent?
Yeah, this is the greatest challenge, you know, and apparently this is something happening. I've read extensively about how also human rights education has struggled to be included in mainstream curriculum because there is resistance. So resistance is a major factor in this. And I do not have an answer. What I know for sure is the students are really asking for this change. And I have a concrete example because when I started teaching with TEP in Lund University in Sweden, where the approach is mostly horizontal and student-centered, but if you wish, sometimes it goes more towards an hybrid, where teachers are still hold most of the power in the classroom. So again, even the distinction I'm drawing, it's a bit more blurred because we know that we live in worlds where the different paradigms coexist. So this idea of the teacher leaving power or sharing power with students is one of the greatest problems we face. But this is what happened. When I left Sweden and started developing this project abroad, right now in Morocco, a department where I was working called me to say, look, we don't know what to do because students coming from all backgrounds, they're asking to change the way we teach. So there is also a demand, very important from students, to change the way we teach because this is something that they need for the future. So either this comes from students from diverse background asking for more inclusion or just from students to ask for a change in the way we teach. This is like the bottom up. What is happening also at the top down level is that organizations like the UNESCO or other important organization in the world, there is a call, global call for transforming education. So in my work, what I've tried to do in connection with this debate is to offer one path, one way forward, not the only one, to operationalize this demand coming both from students and from top-level organization engaging with transformation. And when I started this work more spontaneously, just to respond to my student needs, then I looked around, spoke with colleagues from all around the world, and then I saw that this paradigm shift is happening already. It's happening in so many practices. So I think that also this is to emphasize because sometimes academics, we come in and say, okay, we have invented something, because we write and we have to put ourselves in the forefront. But TEP, it's a collective endeavor. We are collectively building this new paradigm, this new way of doing things. And as I said, my approach is one among others that want to contribute to the larger debate. Have I answered your question?
Absolutely. I want to shift the focus a little bit to an area you've worked on a lot, which is migration. And you have discussed and studied the issue of world migration quite a bit. It is one of the most pressing human rights issues on the globe right now. So I'd like you to talk about how you feel instituting your TEP program would actually strengthen the human rights of migrants. and improve their integration in new societies?
Yeah, thank you for asking these questions. Yes, as you said, I've worked quite a while on the topics of migration. It's the topics I research, the topics I teach, and also I do have once in a while collaboration with international organizations to work around these issues. And there was a moment 2 years ago when I completed my first draft of the book and systematized this idea, is that I happened to give a consultancy for an American organization called American Friends Committee Society. And the project was around borders and what is the impact of border externalization and militarization on migrants and also affected communities. And it was very interesting because the first part of the project was me with a team. We just developed a research that was sensitive to, of course, communities' perspectives and so on. We had this intersectional, the colonial approach to try to be more inclusive as possible. And that was my work as a migration scholar. But the second part is that they asked to validate the work through a meeting with the communities we engaged with. So we met in South Africa in 2024. Yeah. And that's what happened. I kind of got the opportunity to pilot the same approach I was using in higher education. So the different activities I described, the prepare environment, the meaningful content that was the research we had just done. So we infused this educational journey of the research we did to see how the communities we were engaging with would relate to that topic. And that's what we found very interesting, that there were so many convergences. So it was a way for them to reflect to the same topics as we did as academics, using their own views as researchers, and then implementing that. And this is what I would like to emphasize, is one point. And of course, people familiar with critical pedagogy know very well. There is a huge difference between sensitizing and the process that we call conscientization. So sensitizing is where people are simply made aware of migrant sufferings, community suffering. But this can remain superficial. And even as famous pedagogist Michalino Zembilas, who works on peace education, sometimes sensitizing, especially in very difficult time like ours, can actually bring to apathy and not action, because people get afraid. So he called it like, be aware that we can fall into what he calls the pedagogy of despair. But conscientization is the idea that we bring knowledge and sensitize communities, but also in Europe, population that now is more drawn towards anti-immigrant parties and rejection of migrants. Bring them into a space when they understand the depth of the problem and that migrants are not the cause, that there is a structural problem, but at the same time, as educator, giving also solutions or help communities bring new solutions. And that's where the pedagogy of hope comes in, is the idea that there is always a human action that can intervene to solve problems in society. And I think this is where we are finding ourselves nowadays, in a situation in which politics is denouncing, but not offering solutions. And so we live in a time of despair, unfortunately. And migration is one of the examples of what we observe today.
Well, it seems to that a centerpiece of your argument focuses on building capacity for addressing controversy. And so this is a long-standing approach in the United States, although it has not become, I would say, as pervasive as it should be. And currently, in the current administration, they want to basically silence all controversy. So I'm asking you, what is it about your approach with TEP that would put controversy at the center of instruction?
I'm very happy you asked this question because it's the way I developed TAP. It was the idea that too often education shies away from key questions that society has to deal with, but that our students are mostly affected by this. And I would say that this was exactly a practical problem at first, Bill, because I was with students coming from all over the world, teaching topics in times of polarization. So I did that in Italy, in Sweden, but sometimes also in Canada back then, but also Canada has changed, you know. So migration is more controversial today than it used to be when I did my PhD 10 years ago. So we see this happening everywhere. And even in Morocco, you know, the same thing. There are so many controversies. So society are affected by controversies. It's part of being in society. But then today, we know that controversies are more sensitive topics than they used to be in times of polarization. So this is the point, that my idea was we cannot shy away from this, especially if we are teaching these topics to the students, because then instead of helping them, we are hurting them as well if we don't engage with the issue fully. So racism, borders, gender, my topics are just some examples, but any topics that we teach can be controversial nowadays, right? We have also people who deny the existence of climate change. So that is controversial, especially when conspiracy theories are so widespread in society and our students are taking on this kind of thing. So it's also a way, I believe, if we engage in education in this way, so tackling controversy directly and find a way to do that, then I get to how I do it, or I try to do it, then this we are addressing one of the most important challenges of our society, and we transform this into opportunity. But let me explain why then teaching controversies led me to TAP and something that then I theorize later on. Controversies are not about debating per se. Why? Because controversies are about conflicts of values, about how we understand society. So, and society is divided by different groups with different interests and values. And that is what creates a controversy. So in Europe nowadays is the mosques, but in Morocco, for instance, it's related to LGBT rights, because it's so much in conflict with the religious views, then that becomes the greater controversy. I mean, controversies usually are more or less the same in all societies, but they change. And that's the point. It's not about teaching a controversy per se, but it's to help students deal with controversies in society. And that's why I believe that an horizontal teaching approach that does not take into account emotions can fall short, because controversies are about dealing with complex emotional ideas. Emotions are political, like Michalino Zembila says, and that's why I draw extensively on Michalino Zembila's work on peace education to say that his insights can very much be used also to teach controversial issues in democratic society, in society that have not faced war. And there is so much to learn from his work. And his idea is we use a pedagogy of discomfort. So we push the debate, but in a safe space, making sure that we don't harm students. And that's why I had to develop that as a strategy to make sure also the students don't get hurt in the process of learning.
Well, you know, it's interesting that you're talking about this idea of engaging the topics that people often don't want to talk about. Because back in the 1950s in the United States, two scholars, Maurice Hunt and Lawrence Metcalf, wrote a very important book. They talked about teaching about the closed areas of social interaction. And one of them was racism. And I think that's very parallel to what you're talking about. In other words, let's open up the dialogue into these controversies that we must address in order for society to become more humane, in order for society to actually make progress for all people. And so I think it's very parallel, quite interesting. But I want to turn now to a few final questions. If you have another comment, go right ahead.
Yeah, and I was saying maybe, I'm not sure it works. It does work with my students, but my students tend to be a little bit in the middle politically. You know, our students in social sciences tend to be a bit progressive. So we don't know how this will work with more radicalized groups or more radicalized students. Although I must say that once in a while, I have a student who is more radicalized, but it's not the majority. But it's maybe a way to also move away from ideology. And sometimes, you know, critical pedagogy is rejected in certain circles of education because we associate it with a certain political approach. And that was a bit also my say that there's so much in the work done in critical education that can inspire us to move forward into a model that speaks to everyone. But the point is that we need to make it not ideological, and that's the whole challenge, right? Because who holds the moral superiority of an argument, over another. And this is the problem that maybe also makes controversy difficult to treat. And that's what we have seen sometimes, teachers at one point standing, to protect maybe a group, a marginalized group, so defending the students against other students that are not sharing the same ideas. And this is maybe something we would like to avoid as well.
Right. You don't want people, in order to provide safety for one group, to provide a closed approach to another group. You need to have an open dialogue, but a safe one that everybody feels respected.
Indeed.
So let's turn to our final few questions. Now, we use these questions for every person who's been on the podcast. So let me ask you this. Who would be the most influential role model for your work in human rights?
I love this question. So one person who has deeply inspired me in my educational work, especially later on when I started, as I said, digging into the scholarship in the US and Latin America to find answers to my practical problems as an educator in Italy at the time, is Jeff Duncan Andrade, professor at San Francisco State University, who founded this famous school, Roses in Concrete Community School in Oakland. I very much appreciate his insistence that education must cultivate both critical awareness, so denouncing a situation, but also hope, because hope is what transforms society. I interviewed him a few years ago for my short podcast on building hopes, where the idea was to look for educators who were changing the world through their practices. And that's how I discovered this school, and discover also that it's very well known in the US, but a bit less in the rest of the world. But meeting this person was really a turning point. He helped me see more deeply that success in education is never just individual. It must be collective, rooted in well-being of communities and also in healing. Healing of the marginalized communities is also healing for the entire society. That's the lesson I learned back then. And it has deeply shaped the way I see education today.
So what quote most effectively sums up your view of the importance of human rights?
Okay, right now I will touch something that I haven't spoken before. I'm deeply influenced as well by spiritual teachers in Buddhism and also Sufism. So one quote that captures my view on human rights and education, and I think deeply inspired my work with TAP, comes from the Sufi poet Rumi. He said, "Your task is not to seek for love, but merely to seek and find all the barriers within yourself that you have built against it." And this is the idea of transformation I spoke about in TAP. Sufism teaches that love is not something external we must find, but something already present that we uncover when we remove fear, prejudice, and division. For me, this resonates deeply with TAP and what we spoke about before. Education as at its best, is about dismantling barriers, stereotypes, inequality, structure of oppression that prevent human beings from seeing one another in their full dignity. In this sense, STEP is humanizing, as I said before, because it helps learners cultivate empathy, solidarity, and responsibility that allow love and justice to flow more freely in society. And this too speaks, I believe, to our moment. And then I would like maybe to conclude with this, is that the world needs healing. So we need to speak more also in education about how to heal. And so in that sense, it's my conviction that education can be powerful in that sense, to lead to a deeper work that society needs to do to achieve human rights.
So our last question, if you had one recommendation to make to advance human rights education, what would you recommend?
I think, I'm not sure I have an answer for this. What I think is part of the work we discussed today is that just like in critical pedagogy, we need to think more deeply how we want to bring all the insights coming from human rights education in all levels of education, all spaces possible. And in my journey working on TAP, working at the Raoul Wallenberg Institute, where also it's a famous center for human rights education, that's also how I learned more about the field, we noticed this mismatch. When educators also in human rights education, they teach in universities and then they do the programs on human rights education. We need this integration to come and to bring all the knowledge we have to say that human rights education is not an ideological stand. It's not something that we just need to do because we believe it's right. It aligns with the profound needs of humans to be respected in educational settings and beyond that in society.
Well, Teresa, this has been a wonderful dialogue, a wonderful conversation, and I personally think your book is going to have a very significant impact as long as it's widespread and people read it, because you really have, I think, synthesized quite a few of the most important concepts that will, I think, drive the dialogue and the process forward.
Thank you. I hope as well that people will read it and that this interview allowed also to have more insights on what my work is about, and also with other colleagues we are working all around the world to spread this kind of pedagogical approaches for the future.
Well, thanks very much for being with us today.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Human Rights Education Now. You can find additional information about this podcast series at www.hreusa.org. Each episode is available on the HRE USA podcast page, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Pocket Casts, Player FM, and Deezer. You can also download each episode as an MP3 file. If you have questions or comments about this podcast, send them to Christy at hreusa.org. That's KRISTI@hreusa.org. Our podcast team includes producer and editor Bill Fernikes, executive producer Christy Redelius Palmer, editor Elizabeth Schwab, sound designer and project manager Sabrina Sanchez, communications and public outreach coordinator Tia Hins, and production coordinator Jasmine Chizu Gota. Human Rights Education Now is a production of Human Rights Educators USA, a project of the Center for Transformative Action in Ithaca, New York.